Hey World Civilizations, I'm Mr. Lassiter,
And Mr. Guilford.
and we're between two pepper plants. Welcome to your Imperialism and World War I review video. We're not going to go through every question this time around. Instead, we're going to hit one from each section. So there still is a lot of work for you to do on the study guide, but hopefully this will make sure that you're on the right path. All right. So we're going to go ahead and get started. And Mr. Guilford, tell us a little bit about how industrialization was linked to imperialism.
Okay, well, this is an important question because it links our last unit up with this current unit. And so what you've got is industrialization leads to more imperialism. First of all, because it leads to increased demand for resources. Industrialized nations are starting to produce more, but these little tiny nations like England need to bring in more resources from outside in order to support their population. And so they start importing stuff like cotton, stuff like wheat from their colonies in order to support themselves. On top of that, they also need a market for their manufactured goods. So they're producing all this stuff, but these factories that are making everything need people to sell the stuff to. And after a while, they've sold enough to the people in their country that those people don't want to buy anymore. So they need new people to sell to, and by expanding your empire, you can take over places and make them buy your stuff. So that also leads to economic growth for the home country. And last of all, new technologies, stuff like steamboats and machine guns, make it easier to take over places. So those are the three things that link industrialization with empire.
Manufactured goods are my favorite type of goods.
Oh yes, definitely.
I much prefer those to other goods.
Non-manufactured goods. All right, now, Mr. Lassiter, could you please tell us what regions Great Britain controlled during the imperial era?
Yes. So this would be a good opportunity for you to look and make sure that you still have your maps. Do your class still have the maps?
I doubt it.
Mine better have the maps. Anyways, so Great Britain controlled pretty much the world, could we say? They controlled Great Britain, we'll start there. In South Asia, they controlled India and what makes up modern-day India and Pakistan. They controlled many different parts of Africa, some of the more significant parts, Nigeria, South Africa, which they took from the Dutch, Egypt and Sudan, the Gold Coast. And so those are some of the major areas. They had spheres of influence in China after they fight the Opium Wars. They control Australia and New Zealand. And they also have economic control in certain regions, not necessarily political control, especially in Latin America. And let's not forget Canada, which was part of the Commonwealth, although technically independent.
I thought it was still part of Great Britain.
Well, they still have a queen. So,
there we go.
That's lame. All right, no offense, Queen E2. All right, so I would like to know more about why India was such an important part of this British Empire.
Well, that's an interesting question, Patrick.
Good, because I would like to know the answer.
All right, well, I'll tell you. So the Indian part of the British Empire was called the crown jewel of the empire.
Because they had jewels.
Well, they did actually have rich ruby deposits, but I would say that that's not the main reason why they were important. The main reasons why they were important is, one, they provided a huge market for British factories to sell manufactured goods to. So there were, I forget exactly how many, but there were like 10 times more people in India than in England. So all these people are people who are going to buy British manufactured goods. So that's a lot of money for British factories. On top of that, India was a great place for producing important commodities that were important for the British economy. Cotton and wheat and tea were all grown in India and shipped to Britain. Wheat and tea were eaten by the British. Cotton, not so good for eating, but it was used in their textile factories where they would produce cotton cloth no longer made in England, but it would have been 100 years ago. And then they sell it to the rest of the world. And last of all, there is opium, which can be grown in India. They grow the opium in India, They don't bring it back to England. Well, at least they try not to. Instead, they take it to China. They force the Chinese to buy the opium and then use those profits from China to bring back good Chinese stuff or just a whole bunch of silver and gold from China.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So those are the two big things. Lots of good stuff is produced and lots of people there to buy British stuff.
That's very informative.
Yes. Now, Patrick, let's move on to Africa.
Mr. Lassiter.
Of course, Mr. Laster. not Patrick. So, what was the scramble for Africa, and how did it begin?
So the scramble for Africa is exactly like it sounds. It was European nations scrambling for whatever pieces they could get of the continent. It begins with King Leopold II in Belgium sending, oh gosh, what was this explorer's name?
Stanley.
Yeah, Stanley.
Manly Stanley.
Into the Congo to explore and try to set up some trading alliances with the people there. And other European nations see this and they're like, whoa, like Belgium, tiny little Belgium, hold your horses. We want some of this land as well. And so Otto von Bismarck and Germany call together all the European powers, nobody from Africa, mind you, and decide that in Berlin in 1884, they are going to redraw the lines of Africa. You should know this well, class, because we played a game related to this. Keep in mind that European rule after the scramble for Africa was oftentimes brutal. We had several examples of war. In our video, we talked about genocide that occurred. We talked about how Africans were not even consulted about this. Lines were drawn through tribal boundaries. People of different ethno and linguistic groups were put all together. It led to, I would say, a great deal of problems later on. But we're still like 40 years from studying that.
Yeah, we're pretty far away. But the consequences are not good. I would give it
2 thumbs down. All right.
I guess that's another question for you.
Yeah. Well, I answered the last one so well, we might as well come back to it.
Yeah, it was beautiful. So now let's talk about China and Japan. Could you tell me, how did Europeans interact with China and Japan during the age of imperialism?
So Europe wanted basically the same thing from both of these. They wanted to be able to sell their goods in these regions and get whatever awesome what awesome goods were made in China and Japan that they didn't have access to. And so they demand that China and Japan, which had been very isolated nations with just like one trading city each, they demanded that they trade with Europe. And so in China, Britain actually fights the Opium Wars in order to open China up, and different nations, including European nations and the United States, can't forget about them, they have their own spheres of influence for trade. China resists it. But Japan, when the United States rolls up in their harbor with a bunch of warships, realizes that this is probably inevitable, and the best thing to do is to open up trade and start getting a lot of really good ideas on industrialization from the West. And so while China is kind of against this and fights some rebellions and tries to kick the Europeans out unsuccessfully, Japan opens up and starts to industrialize so much that they themselves become an imperial power in East Asia. So Japan's going to open up and be pretty powerful coming up pretty soon.
Try and beat Europe at their own game.
Yeah, and they almost do.
Well, yeah.
Interesting. Mr. Guilford,
yes.
Tell me a little bit about imperialism in the Americas. Specifically, I would really like to know, how did the United States relate to Latin America during the late 19th and early 20th centuries? That's the late 1800s and early 1900s.
Yeah.
In case you were confused.
I always hated that system. No, I thank you for clarifying. So the United States was a very powerful industrial nation at this point in the late 1800s. And Latin America had not really developed any industry to speak of at this point, partially because of political instability and stuff like that. So the United States, being big and strong, does what most big and strong nations do throughout history and begin exploiting its neighbors. And so what the United States does is basically set up an informal empire throughout the Caribbean and Central America and parts of South America. So basically they treat Latin America as if it's like their backyard and say to the other imperial powers, this is our place, we can intervene here, we can do whatever we want to help, American interests, but if you come over here, we will view that as an offense against America. Latin America is our zone to take care of and to exploit. And this is all summarized in the Monroe Doctrine, which tells Europeans that the Western Hemisphere is for America to exploit, not Europe. And the Roosevelt Corollary goes on to say that America is allowed to intervene militarily anytime they feel like they need to.
And Latin America loved this, right?
Latin America does not love this,
Oh, no.
but they're more or less powerless to resist the United States because they don't have the industry and the military to resist and to determine what their countries will do for themselves.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yes, it does.
So that was imperialism. We got through that in about 11 minutes.
That's pretty
Mr.
good
Gifford.
considering that usually these videos take us about an hour.
Yeah, and so we're halfway home.
Mm-hmm.
We're going on to World War I, guys. Hang on to your butts. All right.
Okay, so now we're going to be talking about the beginning of World War I. So, Mr. Laster, how were the causes of war linked to things that we've already studied, like industrialization, nationalism, and imperialism?
Yes, so we have to understand the four main causes of the war: militarism, alliances, imperialism, and nationalism, mixed in with a lot of other things. But as you so eloquently said in your connection between industrialism and imperialism, we see that industrialization leads to imperialism because they need raw materials. And so these countries are starting to spread their empire. It also leads to an increase in the amount of military power these countries can have. If you can turn out huge tanks or ships or automobiles or guns or ammunition or come up with new chemicals for firing these weapons, what have you. So industrialism is heavily tied to both imperialism and also militarism. In addition to that, ideas like nationalism developed during the Industrial Revolution and are bolstered or made more important by imperial powers as they grow their territory, as they grow their military. And so it creates this intense patriotism in these nations, so much so that World War I comes along and they think they're going to win a very short war. They don't. That's it. That's about it. All right.
Cool.
So, big question here. This is maybe the biggest of all questions. How does World War I start, Mr. Guilford?
Okay.
I missed that video.
Well, so we've already talked about the long-term causes: militarism, alliances. Oh my gosh, Maine. Imperialism. Yes, competition and nationalism. That's terrible. You probably should just not even listen to me. So those are the long-term causes. Those are kind of like all building up. Historians have compared it to a powder keg. So nationalism and militarism and alliances and imperialism are all basically causing tension between all the different major powers in Europe. But what is the spark that starts this terrible four-year explosion that is World War I? So it's kind of a complex story that I'm about to tell you. So it starts with Austria-Hungary in 1908. Austria-Hungary wants more land because that's what all empires really want, is more land. And so they annex their tiny little neighbor, Bosnia. Now they have a new tiny little neighbor called Serbia because they got bigger. So they have.
Story's ridiculous.
So
but it happened, guys.
But so Serbia is now the new neighbor. Serbia is upset that Bosnia now belongs to Austria-Hungary because the Serbians believe that Bosnians should really be part of the Serbian nation because they speak a similar language. Now, the Serbian government is backing a Serbian nationalist terrorist group that is active in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. One day, Franz Ferdinand is touring the capital of Bosnia when he is assassinated by a member of this terrorist group. And so he's dead. And Austria-Hungary is upset about this. And so because Austria-Hungary is upset and because they're an empire and they want more land, they decide they're going to declare war on Serbia and take over Serbia and make it part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. I don't know if that really makes sense. Why do you want people that want to kill your rulers as part of your empire? But they do.
Show them who's boss.
So they basically get ready to declare war on Serbia. Russia says in response to in response to Austria, hey, leave Serbia alone. They're Slavic, we're Slavic, they're like our little brothers. You can't conquer them. And Austria says, well, we're going to. And Russia says, well, then we're going to declare war on you. And so Austria runs to its big brother, Germany, and says, Germany, Russia's going to declare war on us if we declare war on Serbia. Will you back us up if we declare war on Serbia and declare war on Russia? And Germany says, sure thing. So now it all starts. Austria declares war on Serbia. Russia declares war on Austria. Germany, to back up Austria, then declares war on France and Russia. And so they decide that they're going to attack France first, following their masterfully thought out Schlieffen plan, where they invade
The Schlieffen plan.
the Schlieffen plan, where they invade France through Belgium, thereby making Great Britain angry. And Great Britain enters the war to protect Belgium. There's a map.
Germany, there,
Yes.
through Belgium
Into
to
France.
France.
So Germany invades France. France enters the war, obviously. Great Britain enters the war, too, to defend Belgium and also to back up France, with whom it is allied. So that is how the war starts, and how all the major powers in Europe get sucked into an argument that is really just between Austria and Serbia.
The end.
Totally nuts, right? All right.
That was good. Can you explain these concepts? We have a few concepts I want you to explain here. What is a war of attrition? What is a total war? And what is economic warfare?
Okay, so these are three new concepts of war that come to define World War I and World War II to a certain extent. So to understand what a war of attrition is, first we should understand what wars were like before World War I. Before World War I, wars were usually wars of conquest, where one army goes in, beats the other army, and takes over some territory, and the war is over. And these wars could usually be pretty short. They might even only last like a month or two. And so basically you go in, you conquer an area, war is over. The war of attrition comes about in World War I because neither side can gain an advantage. The defensive weapons of barbed wire and machine guns are so effective that trench warfare develops and neither side can conquer the other side. And so how do you win a war if neither side can attack successfully? What they decide is that the best way to win is to force the other guy to run out of stuff. If you can tire the other guy out, then he will have to surrender and you will win the war. So if you can kill all the other guy's men, if you can make him use up all his industrial equipment, or if you can starve him out by blocking food or other important resources, they will quit and you will win the war. That is a war of attrition. A war of attrition usually leads to total war. Total war is our next big concept. And total war is where a country uses all available resources in order to win the war. And so that would mean that every young man would be drafted to the army, every old man, every woman, every child would be expected to stay home and do stuff that would directly contribute to winning the war. So the entire economy shifts and starts focusing on warfare. And this makes sense, right? Because if you're trying to win a war of attrition and the other guy is also trying to attire you, then I don't know what the verb form of attrition is. But so if the other guy's trying to wear you out, you need to call on all of your resources, all of your people, that way you can last longer than the other guy. And the last concept, economic warfare, is basically where you try to deprive the other guy of crucial resources. And you can usually do this by blocking off trade. And so if you block off trade, that means they can't bring in stuff from their colonies, they can't get stuff from outside, and so they're going to be more likely to run out of food or other important resources, and therefore to lose the war of attrition. And so those are three different things, concepts of war that all become important during World War I.
Muy bien.
Danke.
What?
Thank you.
I know.
So
I've seen Ferris Bueller's Day Off. I know the song Danke Shane.
Okay, good. Well, in that case, speaking of which, let's talk about Russia.
Russia.
So, Mr. Lassiter, could you tell us how the Bolsheviks rise to power in Russia?
Sure thing, comrade. In Russia, we have to understand kind of what's going on before the Bolsheviks come in, which is that they have a czar. He's an absolute monarch, Nicholas II. He is in complete control of Russia, but he's going to lead Russia into this World War I and do a really bad job of it, basically. And so Russia becomes very weak from this. The Russian Tsar becomes weak over this. In the country, there's a lot of dissatisfaction over war. As prices go higher, bread becomes scarce. People are dying in huge numbers. And so his power overall is kind of weakened. And so he's going to be overthrown by something called the March Revolution. And a temporary government is going to be installed, led by Alexander Kerensky. And this temporary government makes a fatal mistake. They probably could have controlled Russia. We had some socialists involved, had some people who wanted democracy, etc. They all wanted representative government. The problem was that they decided to keep fighting in World War I. And that was kind of the reason why people didn't want the Tsar anymore. And so they make that fatal mistake. And these Bolsheviks, which is a group of people who subscribed to communism, they were led by Vladimir Lenin, and they rise up against this interim government. And they unite these kind of smaller group of socialist people known as Soviets, and they promise the people an end to war, a redistribution of land, and a transfer of power, industrial power and political power, to the workers and the Soviets themselves. And so with all this support, the Bolsheviks rise up with Lenin, and in the November Revolution, overthrow the temporary government. After that, we see a civil war breaking out, but the well-disciplined army and the united army of these Bolshevik communists take over as their enemies are disorganized. Basically, they don't want the same thing. And so the Bolsheviks are managed to hold on to power and establish a communist state in Russia until the 1990s. Yeah. That's it. Let's talk about peace. You know, all this warfare.
Yeah, like can't we just
get along, man?
Yeah.
For at least 20 years before the next one.
20 whole years.
20 years.
21, I guess.
Yeah.
But so that's pretty good.
So tell me about the peace process. What were the results of the Treaty of Versailles? And if you do that, I'll tell you about the League of Nations.
Sweet.
Deal?
Okay, so two more or less failures.
Yeah.
All right, so
why don't we spend 2 days on failures? Because they're important.
Yeah, sometimes failures are just as important as successes
Yes.
in world history. I don't know. So there's hope for all of us out there. So anyway, what is the Treaty of Versailles? The Treaty of Versailles is the major treaty that comes out of the Paris Peace Conference. And this is the treaty that deals with Germany. So even though there were other powers in the war, Germany is kind of the crucial nation that they focus on after the war because it's the strongest. Austria and the Ottoman Empire just kind of collapse, so there's really no reason to punish them because they're not even the same country anymore. But Germany's in trouble. And so the Treaty of Versailles basically decides that they're going to punish Germany for the war and try to weaken Germany so they can never fight another huge war again, which clearly they fail at. But so what does it call for? One, it takes a bunch of land away from Germany and gives it to various people like Denmark and France and Poland. Two, it forces Germany to pay an insane amount of war reparations. Basically, you give money to the people who beat you. And it's something like 33 billion American dollars at that point, which translates today to almost $500 billion, which is an incredible amount of money that Germany says it cannot pay off, and in all honesty, it really cannot pay off after just losing a brutal war of attrition. Three, what is three? Oh yeah, Germany is forced to demilitarize. It has to basically cut its army and navy in half, get rid of all its big battleships, and its air force is completely eliminated. On top of that, it has to move its army out of its western border. That way, if it wants to invade Belgium again, it'll take it an extra couple minutes. And last of all, they deserve it. Remember the Congo. But
that is true, yeah.
Last of all, they're forced to sign the War Guilt Clause. And the War Guilt Clause is where Germany accepts full responsibility for the war and says, hey, this is our fault, so it makes total sense for you to take our military away and tax us a whole bunch. So that's the Treaty of Versailles. The major effect is that it makes Germany really angry, and they feel like the victim, and they are susceptible to crazy militaristic people in the next couple of years who say this is unfair, we should make Germany strong again and fight another war against all these oppressive powers. We'll talk about that more later. All right, Mr. Lassiter, could you please tell us what were the aims of the League of Nations?
Yeah, so the poor Treaty of Versailles creates an organization, the forerunner to the United Nations, called the League of Nations. It was proposed by Woodrow Wilson in his 14 points, and it wanted to promote international cooperation, peace, and security, open and honest relationships between nations, hopefully come up with some form of international law that these countries could abide by, and of course it wanted to deal with issues of health and security and human rights. It does some of these things, but it has a lot of weaknesses. For example, everything has to be unanimous. And the last time I think all of Europe agreed on something was when the Romans were in charge.
There were still the Germans
fighting
the
so
Romans.
never.
So
yeah, that was a dumb idea. Anyways, so it's very weak. It has its own weaknesses, but we're not going to go into that too much right now. Know that one of the big weaknesses is that the most powerful country in the world, which is on the scene here, the United States of America, does not join, even though it is proposed by good old President Wilson.
yeah, and you can imagine how the European nations might have found that a bit confusing.
Yeah, and annoying.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. But so I guess that was the last question,
that was it.
Right?
That's done. We're
Great.
done.
Well, so yeah, guys, I guess after listening to this, you should just provide equally thorough answers to the many questions we did not get to.
Yeah. I do think that some of our answers might have creeped over into others, so, hopefully that'll help.
All right.
All right. This has been an episode of Between Two Pepper Plants.
Cheers.
Cheers.